Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I think people are going to slowly trickle in. So again, good afternoon. Thank you. We'll try it one more time. Good afternoon. Thank you. So this panel is actually going to be on the U.S. and Latin America, and the person who's going to speak on Latin America may or may not be able to make it in here. So. And may not be able to be here for the whole panel. So when he comes in, I may interrupt what we're doing to introduce him. But you guys heard a little bit from me this morning about sort of the basics on the U.S. program. But I want to talk to you guys a little bit more about some of sort of how these laws are getting passed and a little bit of the information sort of behind all of those laws and regulations. So I am currently the Executive Director of Americans for Safe Access, but I'm also the founder of the organization. And I founded the organization because I became a medical cannabis patient, and there wasn't a lot of information out there for patients. And I actually had a severe neck injury that I was, over the course of treating that neck injury, I started having problems with my kidneys because of side effects of anti-inflammatories and pain medications. And my doctor at the time closed the door behind him one day and asked me if I smoked pot. And I told him I didn't, and he asked me if I knew where to get some. And I looked at him oddly, and I asked him if I was his youngest patient, because I thought he was trying to score marijuana from me. I really had no idea why we were even having this conversation. So this was in 2001. And I had heard about medical cannabis, but really only in the context of people that were dying, people with AIDS, people with cancer treatment, and had never really thought about it for things like anti-inflammatory diseases. And I was 23 at the time, living in San Diego, California, so lucky for me it wasn't that hard to find marijuana. I actually asked all of my friends that listened to reggae music and Wu-Tang if they could help me out. And what I discovered was that it worked. I could actually, if I was using cannabis, I could stop taking ibuprofen, I could stop taking other pain medications. But the next challenge that I had was the supply. Because my friends who were using cannabis, while they were using it, while they listened to music maybe or other things, they weren't using it 6 times a day. They weren't using the amount that I was using. So very quickly I got transferred over to their dealers, and it wasn't anything scary, like The Wire or anything like that. But it was embarrassing, right? It's pretty embarrassing to get your medicine from a skater kid who won't let you who can't answer any questions about the medicine, won't even let you look in his backpack to see what types of marijuana there are. So I, at the time I ran a political consulting firm. And it wasn't convenient either for me to be at an event, at a press conference, and get a call from a dealer saying if I didn't go there right now, I wasn't going to be able to have medicine for a week. So on one hand, I was having a great experience that I found something that was working, and so I was going to save my kidneys. And on the other side, was having a series of frustrating experiences. So I had a friend who lived in the Bay Area of California, San Francisco area, that told me that there were these underground distribution centers, and there were about a dozen of them at the time, and that I should come check them out. So I went to one of them called Berkeley Patients Group that's actually still open today, and that dispensary was actually operating not only illegally at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, right? The law that had passed in 1996 only allowed for individuals to possess it, but there was nothing in the law that allowed for distribution systems. So I went to the dispensary with a letter from my doctor, and they let me in, and I had an amazing experience. Within 30 minutes, I learned more about cannabis than I had known in my whole life. I was from Texas, so I actually thought cannabis was brown and flaky. It turns out it's not. But I also had no idea that there were different strains, that there were different compounds in those strains, that gave it a different desired effect. I didn't know that there were different delivery methods like tinctures, topicals, And, it was a very dignified experience, right? There was someone there that could answer all of my questions. They didn't laugh at my questions. And, I left there with a 2-week supply of cannabis, which was very nice. But I also left, with feeling dignified, feeling like I had just been treated for a medical condition, right? I went back to San Diego and had an experience where I was waiting for one of my skater kid dealers, and actually I was waiting for him in a parking lot of a pharmacy, and an hour went by, 2 hours went by, and he wasn't showing up, and I was just getting frustrated, and I was watching all of these people walk into this pharmacy and leave, and none of them were looking over their shoulders, right? They were just going in and buying their cannabis. And when the dealer finally showed up, he wouldn't sell me the cannabis because he thought I was a cop. I was wearing a suit because I had just come from a press conference. And so I found myself in a parking lot crying my eyes out to a skater kid and was like, this isn't the life I want to lead. So I ended up moving up to the Bay Area to be closer to those 11 dispensaries. And I had been there for 2 months, and there was a federal raid on one of the dispensaries. And I didn't realize it was illegal. I mean, when you walk into a place, with countertops and really knowledgeable staff, and they take your credit card, it didn't feel that it was illegal. And so I was a little, frightened that I'd changed my whole life to be near these facilities, but even more frightened that President Bush had basically declared a war on these facilities and was using all his resources to shut them down. And so I went to all of the facilities and asked them what they were doing to protect themselves, and they said they were keeping their head down. And I said, well, I don't think that is going to work. But I was so honored that these people were willing to wake up every day and commit federal civil disobediences to provide people like me medicine. And so I said, if you're willing to do that, then I'm willing to create a national movement to protect the work that you're doing. And so 13 years later, lots of gray hair later, we now have 34 states that have some type of medical cannabis law, 2 million patients, and over 2,000 dispensaries. But it's extremely hard work because we're not only doing this with an illegal system at the federal level, but there's a lot of rumors. I just want everyone to know that there is only one guy in the United States with a sandwich board, and he's at the beach, and unfortunately it's a very high touristy area in Ventura Beach that asks people to get their recommendation. It's one guy. But that same guy, and that sentiment that he's created, we feel in the United States as well. So it's not just the way Europe talks about the America Medical Cannabis Program. It's the way that all states talk about the California Medical Cannabis Program. So it is a challenge to get people beyond this sort of concept, again, of just feeling better. In the United States, we obviously have a lot in common with those working to reform drug policy laws, but we also have a lot in common with people that are trying to get complementary alternative medicines to be a part of mainstream medicine in the United States. What many of you may not know is that there's also been a very large war on botanicals in the United States. Actually, in the 20s and 30s, all of the botanical medicines were actually removed from the U.S. Pharmacopeia. And that was actually a campaign that was led by the American Medical Association to try to get people to use single compound prescription drugs. And so those drugs were actually had a very similar relationship with the federal government. There were raids on the stores that distribute vitamins and botanical medicines in the 80s. There were several attempts by the federal government to make them illegal nationwide. And actually, in 1994, Congress passed the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, and that was the first time that those drugs actually became legal in the U.S. So only 2 years before California passed its first law. And there's still a constant battle in the US about how herbal medicines can be used. They're not covered by health insurance. Very few doctors recommend botanical medicines. And in the US, medical schools, they don't teach nutrition actually as a requirement. And that's where somebody, where a doctor would learn about supplements and other botanical medicines. So, in the U.S., medical cannabis, we're dealing with two battles. One is the war on drugs and the role that marijuana has within that. And then we're also battling the concept of complementary alternative medicines. Since 1994, we actually have a huge percentage of the population now using supplements and using complementary alternative medicines. And actually, before 1994, about only 12% of the U.S. population used anything outside of prescription drugs for healthcare, and now it's close to 65% that are using vitamins and other botanicals. So while we're also finding, as we heard some of the speakers say earlier, that cannabis doesn't have a place, right? We're not quite a medicine, right? And we're not quite, or we don't want to be any longer, considered a drug of abuse. So this has created definitely a hodgepodge approach of how policymakers will handle this issue. And through the initiative process, which allows voters to vote on laws, not every state in the United States has that ability. Actually, only 21 states have a process by which voters can vote on a law. Those campaigns are like any other election campaign, right? So there's a strategic team trying to figure out what voters like, what they don't like, how to really frame or spin the law. And so what we've ended up with is that when you poll Americans, what most I shouldn't say Americans, people from the United States, sorry, I'm on an Americas panel, sorry. I know there are other countries in Americas. In the United States, sorry. In the United States, I know I am from the United States. I try not to be, but I am. When you poll our citizens, we find that people really understand compassionate use, right? They understand this sort of if somebody's tried everything else and nothing else will work, right? They should use cannabis. Or if somebody is dying and they're not going to be around for much longer, then fine, let them have cannabis, right? That's, even though we know that there's much more to medical cannabis, that's really where we have most sympathy, and that's where we're going to get most votes. And unfortunately, because of the political nature of those campaigns, that's most citizens of the United States believe that that's all there is to medical cannabis, right? All they understand is that this idea that it makes you feel better. And so a lot of the work that I find myself doing, a lot of the work that our members are doing is really trying to fill that education gap, right? And from a bird's eye view, it makes sense that it would take people to learn this, right? Time to learn it. It was only 1994 when we found the receptors, when Shulam found the receptors, to explain what was happening in our bodies when we take cannabis. So it's a very young body of knowledge. And so what it means, though, is that as a patient advocate organization, we have to develop that education. So we work with doctors to create continuing medical education. The endocannabinoid system is not taught in any of our medical schools. So we're really catching people, the current doctors really have no idea what the endocannabinoid system is, and a lot of the work that we do is trying to get that education into medical schools. So we've started by creating curriculums for continuing medical education, and now we've created curriculums that are sort of side tracks to formal education, trying to get doctors to add that into their classroom. And eventually we want to see the endocannabinoid system taught as a part of all medical education in the United States. But we're pretty far off. But we also, as patient advocates, have had to try to figure out how we are going to continue to get access to the plant. And so that's meant not only do we have to become policy experts and sort through various laws and regulations, but it also means that we had to look forward into the future and figure out how we're going to actually regulate cannabis as close to a medicine as possible. And a big missing gap in that was product safety protocols, right? So you have in the United States, a lot of people in the United States use cannabis recreationally and have for a long time. But there are certain states in the United States where that's been more of the case. And those are states where there's an agricultural base for cannabis, right? So in California, Oregon, Washington, cannabis has been a major part of those economies for a long time, right? The underground economies, but a major part. On the East Coast, not so much, right? And so when we've been passing laws in a state like Maine, where there isn't a natural agricultural space of cannabis, it was much easier to pass comprehensive legislation because we were bringing in a whole new system. In places like California, Washington, and Oregon, we're competing with an existing market that it's very hard to lay over a new system on top of that. Does that make sense? I know it's a little complicated, but I think it must be very confusing to look at the U.S. and look at one state versus another. So I'm just trying to create some of the context of why that's there. But my organization actually just recently created a certification program for the medical cannabis industry based on the cannabis monograph that I mentioned earlier and the American Herbal Products Association GMP standards. So there are now and this is all voluntary at this time, we have many companies that are volunteering for us to bring in auditors and make sure that from seed to consumption, these are safe products. So we actually have with us today Dr. Jahan Marcu, who carries many titles, but one of them is he's the chief auditor for the patient-focused certification program. He's going to talk a little bit about those policies. Yeah. You can clap for him.
All right, we'll wait for a moment for the slides. Cool. All right, so today I'm going to discuss with you some results from auditing medical cannabis operations in the United States. So this includes dispensaries, cultivation sites, manufacturing operations, as well as laboratories. So just a disclaimer, I don't have any products for sale. I have, despite years of trying to cultivate lucrative conflicts of interest, none of them have panned out in any meaningful way. So this is the cover of the monograph, the American Herbal Pharmacopeia monograph, and the cover of it has a picture of the cannabis farm at the University of Mississippi. This is the National Institutes of Drug Abuse is a pot farm where they get their research materials. And I think the reason it was included as the cover of the monograph, not because it's the greatest example of a cannabis grow, but because it is a great snapshot or picture of the federal government's view on cannabis. So the first thing you notice is there's some sort of short, bushy plants growing in what appears to be red clay, which is perhaps on the worst medium to grow cannabis in. Also surrounding it in the background is a very tall barbed wire fence with guard towers and cameras. And this is, of course, to ensure that none of the cannabis escapes. But the purpose of a monograph is to act as a regulatory document, a guide to regulators. And this includes the standards for identifying cannabis, its quality, its purity, what would qualify as botanical medicines, what are appropriate pesticides to use, what are heavy metal limits and things like this. The American Herbal Pharmacopeia monograph is also compliant with the U.S. Pharmacopeia. And it's actually referenced in state laws, such as Pennsylvania, SB 3 is being introduced. It cites the monograph as the quality control standards for cannabis. I believe Nevada and potentially Washington State also refer to the monograph as their standards for cannabis quality. So just a brief history, just to summarize what Steph said before we jump into the auditing process. So why do we need this? So in 1996, we have the first laws passed, criminal exemptions for cannabis. So if you're terminally ill and you're using cannabis, you probably won't go to jail. And then in 2004, more protections for patients were established, where you have the first creation of essentially legal sales. Distribution laws are passed in the Bay Area. And then in 2010, you have Colorado with commercial distribution. And with commercial distribution, now you have millions of Americans who have access to cannabis. Now, I know earlier my friend Philippe had mentioned that Canada consumes the most medical cannabis in the world, but I'd like to point out that the United States, it is a U.S. citizen who's a medical patient who holds the Guinness Book of World Records for most cannabis consumed in a lifetime. But there's a real need for product safety because much like with the automotive industry, they have huge recalls. Last year, the United States experienced one of the largest recalls of automobile manufacturer. And then we're already seeing one recall in Colorado already for a product that was made under unsanitary conditions. So with that, the American Herbal Products Association has a cannabis committee. APA has been around for 30 years, helping to guide regulators on herbs. Cannabis is now one of the 28 or 29 plants that are recognized as medicinal plants by APA. And this includes cultivation, processing, accurate manufacturing, packaging, labeling, dispensing operations, and laboratory operations. And now, you can go online and download their guidelines at apa.org. You can actually join the cannabis committees, so if you feel that these are fluid documents meant to adapt to the needs of the industry. So if you have some comments you'd like to make, feel free to join the committees. And so you have these guidelines that were established by both people from the medical cannabis industry who have operations, as well as manufacturers of herbal products. And then on top of that, we have the APA monograph. So we have guidelines for industry and we have guidelines for production and manufacturing, great quality control standards. Now you take those two things and you put them together, you can create an auditing program, which is called patient-focused certification. And so this is an oversight and regulatory program hoping to ensure compliance with local laws, state laws, as well as the guidelines that would qualify cannabis as a botanical medicine. This involves a physical audit, traveling to the places and making sure they're real, and then an annual surprise audit, so showing up unexpectedly to make sure that they're still doing what they're supposed to do. To go through all their documentation, standard operating procedures, documentation of employee training, staff training. Do they have annual staff training? What's their safety training like? You can find out more information at patientfocusedcertification.org. In the bottom there you see these little seals. That's actually what appears on products or reports from laboratories that have passed certification. And so you can readily identify it. In the United States, this is actually really, really important because doctors cannot tell a patient where to get medical cannabis. They can't say, there's this dispensary run by a staff of nurses and doctors, please go there, it's a clean, friendly environment. They can't make recommendations like that. But they can tell a patient to look for a seal, a logo, or perhaps a QR code or some sort of identifier. And so this is a nonprofit third-party certification. It's run through the American for Safe Access Foundation. And the certification is based on the quality standards from APA and from the AHP. And it also has online courses through the Cannabis Training Institute. So if I show up to your cannabis operation and your employees are untrained, we have online modules that they can take and get a diploma if they pass. So this is just, we're going to go through some quick data about just this overview about medical cannabis operations in the United States. So right now the trend is towards voluntary quality control guidelines, but that's shifting to mandatory. So right now, something like 12 states, it's voluntary. All states that are coming online with new programs are absolutely requiring mandatory quality control, third-party certification. But a number of states still have yet to have any operations come online. So this is just sort of breaking down some of the market data by number of operations or businesses. So by far, right now, something like 4,000 operations in the United States that we are able to track live in a market where it's voluntary. Less than 1,000 have mandatory training. Over 1,000 operations in different states have mandatory testing requirements, and places that have mandatory training and mandatory testing are on the rise too under product safety. I know the data looks very similar, but we're looking at different states in terms of the number of cannabis operations. California by far has the most. Colorado is probably a not so close second. But these numbers are probably going to fluctuate and change, especially as things like certification programs become mandatory. And this is just to give you kind of a breakdown of California. By far, largely, mostly dispensary operations. There are a number of cultivation operations and laboratory component which supports both the manufacturing and cultivation dispensaries as an ancillary service. This is one of my favorite things to show to regulators is these are the qualifying conditions. This is another reason why you need a monograph. And part 2 of the monograph is a therapeutic compendium, which hopefully will be finished by this year. But not every medical condition is recognized across every state. This is one of the largest inconsistencies. So if you have Lou Gehrig's disease, you have 11 choices of places to live. HIV/AIDS is not covered as a qualifying condition in every state. But multiple sclerosis is, arthritis isn't. And so this is a big issue too, is having sort of a uniform and consistent policy. But the trend is to get rid of these condition lists. Washington, D.C. recently got rid of its condition list. Probably the most strict program is New Jersey, where I think they only have 3 qualifying conditions, and one of them is not chronic pain. So what does an audit look like? Well, I go into these facilities and I look for a lot of things. And so on the left, there's just a simple picture. This is from a laboratory, making sure that they have all their MSDS sheets. They have first aid kits. They have fire blankets. You look around at a cultivation site. You make sure that there's no pesticides laying around. If I find Eagle 20 at your cultivation site, there is no way that you're producing a product that meets botanical safety standards. Making sure the dispensaries are clean, they have their licensing up to date. And this can change too a lot because there are different signage requirements, parking lot requirements from state to state and sometimes city to city for businesses. And that huge pile of paperwork is a representative image of the amount of paperwork that some of these places have. We're talking hundreds of pages of standard operating procedures that each place needs to have in order to be operating within the guidelines. And so there you see just a few, a small sample of the laboratory audit checklist. It's about 30 pages long. The manufacturing audit is about twice as long. These have roughly anywhere to 150 to 200 some odd auditing criteria. And you go through them, they're citable. So perhaps one would be, does the operation have SOPs for analyzing the potency of cannabis? Okay. They might have that, but have they done a validation report on the method? If they don't have that, that's a corrective action. And so you tally up whether or not the criteria is applicable, whether or not they passed, and whether or not it needs a corrective action and what that is. And so at the end of the day or week, the facility gets a report of everything that needs to be corrected in order to be compliant and get certification. I'd like to show the pictures around here because this is a cannabis laboratory. And as you notice, there aren't huge weed leaves on the side of the building. It's a very clean operation, and I love to take pictures of their fire extinguishers when I visit these places because safety is a big concern, especially with these operations that don't get a lot of help from the government to regulate them. So this is a little spreadsheet from the last 8 months of, maybe 9 months of the PFC. So these are all audits that I have been involved with. So I visited Arizona, California, New Mexico, Maine, Washington, D.C., and Colorado. Mostly done dispensing audits, some cultivation and some manufacturers. It should be noted in New Mexico that the dispensing, cultivation, and manufacturing is a vertically integrated facility. Some states require sort of everything to be done on site versus being able to have a separate place to grow cannabis and a separate place to process it. Some states want it all together. And so what's great about doing these audits is now I have to go back and surprise these people in the next year to make sure they're still following criteria. If you're interested in perhaps becoming an auditor, please feel free to come and talk to me. We're actually training people right now, and it's a lot of fun, I have to say. So what is the most common corrective actions that I see generally across operations? Well, adverse event recording and reporting. So if you have a product that goes out there how do you know when to initiate a recall? Is the side effect just due to a one-time use unrelated to the product, or is it a sign that something's gone wrong? This is the most common thing that needs to be implemented in cannabis operations. The recall plan is very, very important, being able to contact the people who have used your products, being able to track batches of your products. Security is a big issue as well, and this is another thing that is a little bit crazy because it's not consistent across states. Washington State, for instance, it is illegal for you to have an armed guard at your cannabis dispensary. While in Washington, D.C., it is required that you have an armed guard at your dispensary. So that you have a wide breadth and inconsistency. So to make sure that these laws and guidelines are implemented, you kind of have to know what's going on in each different municipality. Waste disposal is a big issue. And this brings me to, some of state requirements can actually interfere with a good quality control program. And I can give you guys a couple examples. Now, the reason why I say police code for marijuana is, I'll take that, is because when I was conducting an audit in Washington, D.C., this dispensary was really, really, really good. And I was having trouble actually trying to cite them for things until I saw how they disposed of their waste. And in D.C., when you have leftover cannabis, whether it's been on the shelf too long or it's gone bad, you put it in a box and the police come and pick it up. And when I asked to see records of how much cannabis the police had picked up, they did not have any because the police refused to give them any information about how much cannabis they had picked up or whether or not it had reached the police station and what it was doing at the police station. So this was a source of diversion. So how do you correct this? So my suggestion was, well, either treat the cannabis in bleach or mix it with cat litter and then see how the officers respond to that. So there are ways to process cannabis waste so that it can't be reused or make someone sick, and this is also a very important part of the audit. The laboratories are the same thing, making sure that proper waste disposal, especially if they're using chlorinated solvents, is another issue, and for the most part the laboratories do a pretty good job. And so, and I'd be happy to tell you guys more stories maybe at the bar later about audits. So this picture is a picture of cannabis growing with a lot of other plants, and so I think the take-home message from the patient-focused certification program is that cannabis can be grown safely like any other agricultural product. And right here it is being grown very safely next to a bunch of other plants, and I believe this is from Northern California. So thank you so much for having me here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
So can we do Q&A? I'm sure you have lots of questions for Jahan. Any questions on the U.S. program?
Actually,
Bring
it's
the mic.
two-part, requiring an answer from you and an answer from you.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
I'm not confrontational. Okay, I introduced myself earlier, so I don't have to again. On your introduction, one of the things that had struck me is the fact, and I'll be talking about it actually tomorrow, and that is that rescheduling is imminent. And there are consequences to rescheduling, and I'll be suggesting tomorrow that they're not going to be too pleasant for many people. How are you planning on handling the whole rescheduling issue? Because that changes the whole ballgame.
Do you want to ask the other question?
And then the other question is more just a comment, but I also work very actively in China on cannabinoids, and they're very nice about disposal. You document incineration, they're happy. So we should be as progressive as the Chinese.
Nice.
But anyway, no, your question is the one that I'm more
Well,
interested in.
most facilities in the United States don't allow combustion of cannabis on the premises.
But a bleach destruction would probably be, sufficient.
Right.
Yeah.
So the question about rescheduling is definitely a controversial one in the United States. Like with the UN, cannabis is a Schedule I drug in the United States, which means it's classified with no medical use. Cocaine is actually a Schedule II drug in the United States. So just to give you an idea how out of whack it is, it's a very political process. And actually, in the United States, when under President Nixon, when we created the Controlled Substance Act, Congress didn't know where to put cannabis in that scheduling, and so they put it in Schedule 1 as a placeholder, and they actually had a commission, which we refer to as a Sherer Commission, actually look into cannabis to see, which schedule it should go on. And the result of the Sherer Commission was that actually it should not be on the schedule at all, that it's a very safe substance. He actually said something about potatoes being more toxic than cannabis. And a few years ago, and of course that report was ignored completely. A few years ago, the Oval Office tapes were released from the Nixon presidency. So in the president's Oval Office, they actually have a recorder, but we don't get to hear them until 20 years after the president has left the office. It's a very interesting piece of information, but we did find out that Sherer and President Nixon actually had a conversation about the report, and Nixon's response was quite racist, and basically said, well, how are we going to continue to lock up the protesters and the niggers, was his response. And then he went into a whole diatribe about why do the Jews want to legalize marijuana anyway. So not one of our country's jewels, so I am not taking credit for Nixon's words, but so cannabis has just stayed in the scheduling, and there have been several attempts to reschedule cannabis, but it's pretty much a fixed system. You have to, you apply, and ultimately the DEA gets to sign off, and DEA, or marijuana is big business for DEA. Something I was actually talking to a few of you about to understand some of the backstory about why the United States is such a prominent proponent of the drug war and all of its elements. A lot of it has to do with money. A lot of people make money off of people being in jail, the process of them going to jail, and so all of those elements come into play into the political atmosphere in the United States. So there's actually one company that provides all the food for prisons. They have a monopoly on that, and so they lobby to make sure that people stay in prison. The Bush family actually owns a company that has the commissary where prisoners, they can't get packages from anybody. They have to only use this store. And so those people, they're actually, their business plan requires there to be as many people in prison as possible. Drug testing companies, all of our former drug czars in the United States own stock in drug testing companies. So it's big business to keep people in prison. And so it's not that every American wakes up and says, how do we put these people in jail? Most people don't know anything about it, to be honest. But as far as the rescheduling goes, a lot of people are asking what would happen if we did reschedule cannabis versus deschedule cannabis. Because anything that's on the schedule is controlled by, right, it's the Controlled Substance Act, right? So these are substances that will be controlled. Under the current definition, if it was put into Schedule 2, some people say that that would mean that it can only go through pharmacies, and that there would be a certain track that is there. And I think that is a possible interpretation. But the truth is that marijuana has been such an exception. As I mentioned, we're not quite a medicine, we're not quite a drug, that I think that the way forward is going to be a combination of policies. And so what I mean by that is that I don't think that marijuana is going to be rescheduled without other laws passing at the same time. So there's going to be several bills introduced this year in our Congress that I know about that actually rescheduling is a part of that, but they also grant the right to the states to they basically hand over the responsibilities under the Controlled Substance Act to the states. So I think the controversy about rescheduling marijuana is really only when you're talking about it in isolation of other policies. Next question? And my answer won't be that long for all of them, sorry.
I have two questions, one for each of you. For you, have you seen and inspected facilities that you wouldn't recommend anything go out of it, like completely poisonous, completely wrong, completely bad? And how bad is some of the things that you've seen? And for you, the question is, do you think that there's agencies or lawmakers or a movement out there trying to hinder inspections like these in order to keep cannabis down? That the less you have inspections, the less it's properly done, the more they're winning the fight to keep cannabis down. Do you feel that opposition? Do you have to fight that opposition?
Good questions. Go ahead. Do you want to answer first?
All right. So before, we don't just pick a cannabis operation out of a hat and say, we're going to go to Arizona today. These places are initially screened to make sure that if we do audit them, that there's reason to believe that they can be brought up to code within a month or 3 months maximum. And so we're not, so if a place is really bad, we probably won't waste the time right now and resources to go, because it's obvious. So we're focusing right now on places that are already really good members of their community. The program is actually well received. In Maine, a dispensary that passed certification actually received a letter. Is it from the mayor?
No, from the Department of Health.
From the Department of Health, congratulating them on being involved in the program.
Yeah, and also it's a voluntary program. So we're like Jahan said, we don't have an official badge that allows us to just show up, I would love to do that. As soon as I get that badge, I'll let you know. But instead, it's companies that want to show consumers that they're doing something right. And the reason that one of the reasons we created this program is that patients don't know. Right? There's nothing in these laws that are telling these companies not to use pesticides or which pesticides to use. And so for patients, this gives a way that we can tell the products apart, right? That we know that at least this product has gone through these GMP standards, that someone has been on site, inspected the product. So what we find is that usually bad actors want to remain bad actors, and so they're not applying for the program. However, as I mentioned, we're not just this, we're a nonprofit. We're not doing this to bring in money. So at the same time that we're offering this in voluntary markets, we're also working with governments to pass the product safety protocols. So the APA guidelines came out in 2011. The monograph came out in 2012. And so as these have come out, we've been able to get these adopted at departments of health, at departments of ag. So in the state of Illinois, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, parts of this are required. Right? And so now we're working with governments to either be a third-party certifier because they don't have the resources to ensure that the product safety is happening, or in some states we're actually training the auditors and certifying their auditors so that the Department of Agriculture of a state can actually do the audit. And the next question was about are people hindering us from doing this program? Because I would say not yet. I mean, there have definitely been. I think you're referring to maybe a talk that I gave the last time I was in Czech Republic about how we have had an issue in the United States where we've tried to create regulatory schemes, and law enforcement have tried to block those schemes because they actually want things to be out of control. So the backstory behind California and all of the crazy policies there is that law enforcement has obstructed our every time we have tried to pass something to create regulations. And in fact, the California Narcotics Officers Association created a series of talks called How to Eradicate Medical Marijuana. And the whole substance of the talk was to let things get out of control and let us hang ourselves. So like in Los Angeles, for instance, we went from having no dispensaries in 2006 to having 105 by 2007. At that time, my organization was meeting with the mayor and chiefs of police saying, it's time to regulate before this gets out of control. The law enforcement came up and testified and said, there's no need, everything's fine, we've got it under control. Within a year, there were 1,000 dispensaries in Los Angeles, and the chief of police held a press conference basically saying there's more dispensaries than Starbucks. and that all these people are feeding, are giving patients things with pesticides on it, and created a whole campaign. And even when there were 1,000 dispensaries in Los Angeles, the city council members were getting no complaints. The entire political theater that was created by law enforcement. Other questions? I think I can take one more.
Could you elaborate a bit more on the training that you offer for medical professionals?
Yes. So we actually have a whole series of different educational programs. We have one that's a program that goes along with the patient-focused certification program that's just for people that work in dispensaries, manufacturers, labs. And then we actually just recently teamed up with an organization out of Boston called the Answer Page they have an online continuing medical education platform. And they now have a cannabis curriculum. And we have actually 20 hours of credits that are actually backed by the American Medical Association. So a doctor in any state can take this education. And in April, we're actually going to be launching a program called the Cannabis Care Certification that actually allows medical professionals to sign up, and we make sure that their licenses are in correct order. We've had a lot of situations in the United States where doctors who actually aren't allowed to practice anymore set up shops and start writing recommendations, and then patients find that they have no legal protection. But another part of that program, the Cannabis Care Certification, is a 2-hour educational course for patients. Now, a lot of people, I think Philippe had pointed out that a lot of the current medical cannabis patients or people who had used cannabis a time before, right, that they're more comfortable. And at my organization, our goal is to move beyond that. And a lot of that is because of my own personal experience. If my doctor hadn't brought up cannabis therapies with me, I don't know if I would be here right now, to be honest. I probably would have had to borrow someone's kidney at the very least. And so our goal is actually to make sure that every doctor in the United States knows about cannabis, that they're not just waiting until their patient is about to die to recommend it, and especially for chronic conditions like chronic pain, MS, that this is a beginning, it's a tool that physicians can use at the beginning of the care of those treatments and not wait until the side effects of other drugs have destroyed the body of that patient. And so when we have surveyed doctors in the US, we found that the #1 reason why physicians won't recommend cannabis to their patients is that they don't want to talk to their patient about using it. Like they're afraid, I guess, of talking about rolling a joint. I don't know. And so we've actually filled in with this educational program that a doctor can give this education to their patient, much like diabetes programs. So in the U.S., if you're diagnosed with diabetes, your doctor makes sure that you take other education so that you understand how to use insulin, right? In a way, cannabis is very similar in that it really takes a strong knowledge base for cannabis therapeutics to work for every patient. And what we don't want to see is a patient getting a recommendation from their doctor, going and picking up a product, not knowing how to use it, not knowing when to use it, and then saying, oh, cannabis isn't going to work for me, right? And so the educational program we've created actually talks to a patient about how cannabis is a different medicine, that it actually takes a success, to use cannabis therapeutics successfully, the patient has to be engaged in the treatment. And so we have patient surveys that they can fill out. What kind of cannabis did I use? When did I use it? What were the, what had I just eaten? That sort of information so that they can make informed decisions. But we also help patients understand how they're going to make the decision when they walk into a dispensary for the first time of which cannabis product to use, which delivery method, et cetera. So the continuing medical education courses are available now through the Answer Page, theanswerpage.org. And in April 1st, or that week, the first week of April, we're going to be rolling out the Cannabis Care Certification Program. Any other questions? Oh, one more. Could I have one more?
Stan Havel, Czech Chamber of Pharmacists. I have for Ms. Sherer, maybe 1.5 question. You said you have 2,000 dispensaries, And I would like to know if they are part of pharmacies, regular pharmacies, or they are different. And the half question is there any conditions for made or set up the dispensaries?
Yeah, so the way every state again is different and has a different law around dispensaries. The reason there are so many in California is that we passed a state law in 2004 that allowed cities and counties to regulate medical cannabis. So some cities and counties banned them, and some cities and counties embraced them, and some of them tolerated them. And so there are 548 cities and counties in the state of California. And so every city and county has done something a little different. But some of them, you just have to have a business license. Some of them, there's a little bit more of the information. As far as pharmacies go, we actually spend a lot of time with pharmacists because pharmacists are actually, they're licensed by the state. They don't have a federal license. And some of the new medical cannabis laws are actually requiring a pharmacist on site in the dispensary, which I actually like that proposal. That can actually explain to the patient the pharmacological effects, how cannabis may maybe affect their other medication. We have an issue where a lot of patients are self-medicating with cannabis, and so they're not talking to their doctor about taking away other medications, right? So if you're using medical cannabis and it's working successfully, I'm not taking 3,200 milligrams of ibuprofen and using cannabis, I'm only using cannabis, right? And so I think that having a pharmacist in that setting can actually talk to the patient about how they can come off of some of the other drugs that they're taking. Pharmacies are regulated by the federal government. You have to have a DEA license to operate a pharmacy in the United States, and so right now they're not so eligible. But a lot of people have asked me, do we want to see a program where people can just get marijuana from pharmacies? And the truth is, yes, my answer would be yes and no. I think that in order for a patient to successfully use cannabis, they need more help than just 2 seconds at the counter, right? They actually need someone who can talk to them about the side effects, that can really make sure that they're using the products that work. And so I think for some people, a pharmacy model could work, but I think that for most patients, I would want to see something closer to a dispensary model where a patient has more one-on-one time with the dispenser.
And also another part of the auditing criteria is a dispensary can't make outrageous claims about what cannabis can treat and have that posted for patients. So part of it too is a judgment call on the auditor to make sure that the dispensary is not saying things that aren't supported by really good scientific evidence about what cannabis may be used to treat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, this is what happens in an unregulated system, right? Is that, it's kind of funny that in the U.S. we call it the Controlled Substance Act, when many of the substances on that list are not regulated at all or controlled at all. And so what we've found, I think one of the hardest things that we're finding with adding product safety regulations is resistance in established markets. Right, so in California, where people have been doing it this way forever because they can, they're often resistant to some very basic protocols, regulatory protocols, where in new markets where there isn't anything there, people will do whatever the regulations say because they can't have a license unless they do that. Any other questions? I think they're going to boot me off. One more question.
Thank you. My name is Martin Poliacek. I already mentioned that before. The second part of the name of this panel was, the first part is about cannabis and the other part is about other controlled psychoactive substances. I don't know if you are the right persons to ask, but I'm going to ask anyway. I know that this is all about medical cannabis, but there are other substances that need to be talked about. And I think, especially in the United States, the these guys that survived the hippie times with a clearly working brain are now, many of them, in leading positions in many laboratories and institutes that are actually relevant in the discussion. And we have controlled substances like DMT, like LSD, that were the subject of clinical tests before and were banned thanks to the conventions of the UN. And I know that there are many voices in the United States now that are calling for very regulated and very controlled, but opening of the clinical trials with, well, I wanted to talk to people from Latin America because, for example, a treatment with ayahuasca is working in Peru, is working in Ecuador, is working in other countries. So what are the, at least, tries in the United States to make this part of the relevant scientific discussion again? Thank you.
So that's actually, there are a few clinical trials. It's a very small group, and it's actually focused on PTSD treatments. And I can give you the name of the people that are doing those studies and get you in touch with them. MAPS is the organization that's doing that study, so I can get you in touch with those. And I see the organizers at the back are ready for us to go. And the person who was going to step in and tell us about the Latin American regulations didn't show up. I promise I didn't just not make room for them, as we do often in the US. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you later.